Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are so glad that you're with us tonight. Thank you for joining us for our September Coffee Convo. We are really excited to see so many people joining us this evening because, like you, we've been eager to learn about the new Massachusetts IEP form. My name is Lisa Nowinski, and I'm a clinical neuropsychologist and the clinical director at the Massachusetts General Hospital Lurie Center. And I'm joined this evening by Gretchen Timmel, educational psychologist and educational consultant at the Lurie Center. Gretchen, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Well, I think that was a good introduction, but I'm happy to be here, and I think that some of the people on the talk today are familiar, and that's wonderful.
It's great to see some familiar faces. We will go ahead and dive right in. All right. So tonight, Gretchen and I are going to talk with you about the new Massachusetts IEP form from our perspectives as a psychologist and as an educational consultant. We are not legal experts. Gretchen will give you a disclaimer in a minute, nor were we involved in the creation of the new form. But like you, IEPs are an important part of our work and our life, and we believe that it's really important for all of us to become familiar with this new form now as we prepare to head into the new academic year. As part of our discussion this evening, Gretchen and I will talk with you a little bit about the history of the new form as we understand it, and we'll comment on some of the big picture changes we see in this new form. We will also review the new form itself with you, highlighting how the new form compares to the old existing IEP form that all of you are familiar with. And in particular, we're going to share with you some of the exciting autism-specific questions and sections that are now included in the IEP form template. And finally, we'll review with you some important takeaways and next steps to consider as you prepare to use the new form in the coming year. All right, so just a little bit of history to get us started. This is really the first time in 20 years or so that the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, or DESE, has updated its IEP resources, including a total revamp of the actual IEP form template, which we will be reviewing tonight. As you know, this form is used to plan and guide special education goals and programming for all students requiring special education services. As we understand it, this has been a process almost 10 years in the making, and it's been led by the State Department of Education, including representatives who are teachers and administrators, as well as advocates and agencies, many of whom you are familiar with, like Mass Advocates for Children. For years, both the state and advocates have agreed that the IEP form, the old IEP form in its existence, needed to be updated. For example, many people have felt that the old form was too focused on deficits and didn't adequately meet the spirit of the federal law IDEA, which encourages collaborative discussions between students and parents and staff. And for those interested, there really was a nice piece reported by WBUR in March of this year that talks a little bit more about this history, and we'll share that link with you. But tonight we're going to focus on previewing the new IEP form with you. And as we dive in, I'm going to pass the floor to Gretchen to talk with you a little bit about the spirit of the new IEP form and to highlight some high-level key changes.
Okay, so as Lisa has brought us around to the history of the new IEP, I just want to underscore that the IEP is new, but it's in process. The Department of Elementary and Secondary Education is continually reviewing the IEP and how to make improvements for students. So this is an ongoing process, and we're at a juncture right now with a new IEP. But the spirit has been collaboration and continues to be collaboration that began in 2014. It may have begun before that with a new accountability framework for special ed. But I just want to underscore again that this is a continual process. The timeline for it, the anticipated timeline for it to be mandatory is the fall of 2024. But some districts are rolling it out now. And there may be changes going, in the future about those deadlines as well. But that's what's anticipated. Okay. So there are some key changes, and these are the key changes that these presenters have determined to exist within the new IEP. And some of the IEP appears to remain the same. You know, it's written in easily understood language, which I think is really important for all communicators. One of the highlights is an improved student participation emphasis. There's a focus on student vision and strengths in a manner that really draws the student into the participation, provides their view of what goals they have in their life, and we'll see that as we move through the form. And another highlight that stands out to us is a stronger focus on English, and whether English is a native language, what is the language of the student, and how does the native language impact learning? And I think that there are more specifics in many sections, such as the accommodations and modifications section, the assessment, the alternative assessment goals, and also the consistent inclusion of the autism specific questions within the framework of the IEP itself, so that it informs discussion moving forward.
Thanks, Gretchen. We're going to jump right ahead into the new IEP form. The content in the next several slides is pulled directly from the new IEP form and complementary stakeholders guide that is available on DESE's website. We will include links to both of those resources at the end of the presentation and are happy to share those with you. But we just want to let you know where the content is coming from in these next few slides. Starting strong on page 1 of the new IEP form, we see that the form is really encouraging a more holistic approach, inviting the student to directly contribute to their own vision, both short and long term. You can see some examples in this form here of questions that might be asked of your student or learner, such as "this year I want to learn," or "by the time I finish elementary school, I want to." These questions are designed to elicit time-relevant goals from the student. And there are a number of additional questions here on the lower portion of the form, or sort of the mid portion here, that are designed for older transition-aged students. In addition, at the bottom, this last section, the last 2 sections on this form here that are titled Team Vision Ideas, should include input from both parents and school staff. In this section, the goal is really to foster communication among team members around the vision for the student. However, I want to highlight just a few important notes here. The first, and it may seem obvious to those of you with young children or students who need more support to communicate, many students may require some assistance in developing their vision statement prior to an IEP meeting. So this is going to be new for all students, and it's definitely something where we anticipate many students and learners will require some support to develop these vision statements. This might be in the form of assistance from a teacher, a school counselor, another service provider. In addition, this section really doesn't provide any specific guidelines for how non-speaking or minimally verbal students will participate in this process. So, of course, it leaves a bit of room for individualization, but also potentially misguided approaches that don't adequately incorporate the perspectives of some of our non-speaking or minimally verbal learners. And so I just want to call your attention to that as you work towards transitioning to this new IEP form. If any of these factors are relevant for you or for your student, we're going to want to make sure that you're discussing with your team how to support your student in participating in the process. We are pleased to see, however, that in the stakeholders guide, so remember, this is a document that sort of accompanies the IEP template on DESE's website. This stakeholders guide clearly indicates that special consideration of parental input should be included when completing the additional team vision section at the bottom of this page. And I want to highlight, because there is no separate parent or student concern section, if you remember that from our old or current form, you'll want to be sure that your parent perspective is really fully and adequately captured here in this section. We are going to talk about throughout the presentation other places where parents can be involved in co-creating the document, but this is one of the first really important sections where we want to make sure that the parent or caregiver voice is also included in creating the team vision here. Next, the new IEP form includes some really nice sections to capture the student's individual profile with a bit more specificity. So this means that critical elements of a student's profile are highlighted at the very beginning of the IEP form, including things like a student's diagnosed disabilities, their English learner status, their language-related needs, and also their need for assistive technology. And so it's really lovely to see that each of these things are included very prominently and very specifically at the beginning of the IEP form. Much of this content was incorporated in different ways in the previous form, but we want to highlight how this student profile section, I think, really nicely sets up the team to hold the student's profile at the front and center of conversations when creating the IEP. And now I'm going to pass the floor to Gretchen to talk us through the next few sections of the IEP that are designed to capture a student's present level of functioning across several areas. And I'll just highlight, because Gretchen, I added these without your seeing them, I highlighted some circles here for our autism specific questions. So keep an eye out for these green circles throughout the next few slides.
Very good, Lisa. I think that one of the benefits, I think, of looking at a form like this is it's very clearly delineated that we're going to now look at the present level of achievement in academics. Okay, because we need to keep track of all the different areas that the student has need in as we move through the IEP. And so, the charting of the student's academic performance is clearly apparent there and needs a checkoff, in the different areas: ELA, history, social sciences, math, science, technology, and engineering. What is new about the second box is that there's an emphasis on the strengths and interest areas and preferences of the student. And I think that's really important to be able to focus on that. And then clearly the impact of the student's disability in participation in the general ed classroom. And the other take home that I have from this, and looking at it a couple of times, is that they're now starting to integrate the preschool experience along with the other age groups, which I think is going to be helpful moving forward so that we can track performances even in young children that are just entering school. The autism specific questions, as Lisa has circled here, are then addressed. And if the answer is yes, that there is an impact on learning, then we're going right to what sections of the IEP are going to be addressing that impact. So we're identifying, explaining, and addressing in the IEP simultaneously. And that's a bit of a different format, which I personally feel will, be beneficial moving forward. And so now we'll take a look at the second slide. And so again, it's very clear: present level of achievement, behavioral, social, and emotional. So again, we're going to describe the current performance. And there is a highlighting of the use of positive behavioral interventions, which has been a part of the spirit of the IEP in the past, but I think it's out in front a bit more for the team to be thinking about that. And then again, we're capturing the strengths and interest areas and preferences moving forward. And then the impact of social and behavioral difficulties in learning. The bullying part is front and center too. I think that there seems to be, at least in this description here, an emphasis on how we're going to teach the student to not be a target of a bully, and how to self-advocate and how to present themselves in a way that's leading to safety and positive social interaction by addressing those social skills that need to be learned. So in other words, it's not just a question of will the student be likely to be bullied or are they at risk for being bullied, but what mechanisms can be put in place in terms of teaching and teaching methodology to strengthen their resiliency and awareness of bullying. And then specifically, how will those needs on the social behavioral arena be addressed in the IEP? And then you have, following again, those specific autism specific questions that are related to that area. Does the student need to develop social interaction skills and proficiencies? Again, it's on teaching rather than just on responding to a bully. Does the student have needs related to changes in the environment or daily routines? Does the student have needs related to repetitive activities and movements? Does the student have needs resulting from their unusual responses to sensory experiences? And then with each box that's checked yes, then we're going to look at the IEP in terms of the accommodations and modifications, the goals and objectives, the service delivery grid, and the additional information that pertains to that particular set of issues. And I think it's much more likely that we're going to capture the areas directly by doing it in a systematic fashion. Lisa, I think I'll give it back.
I think you've got maybe one or two more here.
One or two more? Yeah, okay.
Does this look right?
Yeah. Oh, you moved it on me. Okay.
I did.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, that just leads me back to my point that the font and the the introduction to this section is very similar to the one before.
Yes.
Right. And I think that now we're looking at communication specifically, right? And so here we're looking at AAC devices, which is augmentative and alternate communication devices for students that have difficulty with verbal command, are nonverbal for other reasons. So here, again, we're going to capture the current communication and performance. Again, the strengths and areas and preferences, and then the impact. Now, here's a little bit different. Okay, a difference. So we've always been checking off whether the student requires the use of an AAC device. Now we're delineating, if so, where do they need to use it? Is it only in school? Is it at home? Is it in both settings? Is it in the community? And then we're identifying immediately who needs training in the use of the AAC device in addition to the student. Does the family need training or technical assistance? Other educators working with the students, for example, a student is in inclusion class and has an AAC device. Does that inclusion teacher need training in the device? And that's going to identify the need for the training and also increase the enhancement of the student's use of the AAC device. And then where will it be addressed in the IEP once again? So will it be addressed in accommodations, modifications, goals, objectives, service delivery grid, additional information? There could be more than one box checked off. So again, I think it's going to help make the use of an AAC device more universal and applicable to the student in a meaningful manner in their life. It has the potential to do that with this formatting.
Gretchen, I think there's just one more here.
No, we're continuing. It's interesting because it's the same. It almost looks like it's the same question, but it isn't. We're looking at the achievement in addition. They're calling them additional areas. ADLs, activities of daily living, motor, sensory. And Lisa, you've put down a highlight here, which is really important, and it says it in the form, but parents are only asked to share health information that they want to share. Okay. And so we're going to be looking at all those ADL skills, motor, sensory, vision, hearing, health, all of those parts of the student's life and neurology, quite frankly, that influence learning. Again, the strengths, the interests, and the areas and the preferences, the impact. Now we have delineated different types of disabilities and how we're going to address them in the IEP. Deaf or hard of hearing, okay? And then where is the service going to occur? Okay, accommodations, modifications, goals, objectives, service delivery grid, additional information. Again, more than one box can be checked off. And it's the same for the blind or the visually impaired, cortical vision impairment, which is critical, okay? And this is a new addition for me, screen readers or other assistive technology needed to address. And then orientation and mobility, which is critical. And those things have always been a part of the thought process, but I don't think that the areas that they need to be addressed in have been so clearly delineated in the past. It's going to be harder to miss tracking a student's need across a continuum of their day and their life and their community.
Really helpful, Gretchen. These last 3 or 4 slides, you've highlighted how much additional specificity and structure is built into this new IEP form, where the current form has some much longer sort of open-ended narrative sections at the beginning that allowed for a lot of variability, right? Some teams were really thoughtful and comprehensive, and others sort of included the bare minimum of information in those sections. And so these last few slides that Gretchen's reviewed with us really help us highlight how much more structure and specificity is included in this new IEP form. And we'll move on here to the next section. This section is really starting our transition planning sections, which is unusual because these used to be sort of an addendum or an add-on to an IEP form. This is really relevant and applicable to those of you who are joining us with students or learners who are 14 to 22 years old. So just like before, these sections are required to be completed as part of an annual IEP meeting during the year in which a student will turn 14, and they should be updated consistently from ages 14 to 22 years old. So there's no change in who requires a transition planning form. But if you remember, the old transition planning form really only had 3 main sections that addressed the student's vision, their disability-related needs, and then an action plan. And again, there wasn't a lot of specificity built into that old form. And you can see here in this example, there's 3 slides I'm going to talk to you about these transition planning form sections. But you can see on this first slide that there's a lot more specificity around post-secondary transition, including across the top of this, this grid, current performance, again, in the middle, strengths, areas of interest and preferences, and the impact of the student's disability. Somebody in our chat had a really great question earlier about whether these preference sections apply to everyone with any disability or just autism, and they're really applied to everyone here. But obviously you can see where they're particularly well suited to elicit information for patients with an autism diagnosis. It also breaks this information down the horizontal or the vertical column here across a couple of different areas, including consideration of education and training needs, employment experiences, and then community experiences or post-school independent living needs. And I anticipate that this added specificity is going to make it a bit more seamless for teams to include the appropriate information in this section. With the old form, we often saw insufficient or incomplete information that lacked adequate details. And as a neuropsychologist, I would often be encouraging parents to return to their team meetings to sort of beef up their transition planning form to include much of this information. And now the details are sort of prompted here. So it'll be easier for teams to include the appropriate details in this section. This is also where the student's projected date of graduation or program completion is now located. So I have an arrow pointing to this section here in the middle. But I call your attention to this section because it is a really important thing to consider as your student transitions through their high school years and approaches those transition years from 18 to 22 years old. It asks us to make a projection or prediction about when we expect a student to either earn their high school diploma or a certificate of completion. And they're calling this section projected completion document, right? So either a diploma or a certificate of completion. We want to pay particular attention to this section for students in high school for whom we anticipate more extended transition programming or needs. I really encourage parents and caregivers to try as much as we can to anticipate this so that we help to set and manage expectations for our teens who are, again, participating in this process. If we expect that a student's learning needs will extend beyond a traditional four-year model, we want to start to plan for this here so that our conversations include a projected completion timeline beyond the 12th grade for some students all the way through their 22nd birthday. The form also asks us to specify the requirements for completing either a diploma or certificate of completion. That's this last section here, planned course of study is the title. And it asks us to also update what is the current status of those requirements. So for example, if a student is working on earning their high school diploma, are they currently working towards passing a specific subject matter MCAS test? Is that what they're working on? Is that the remaining need to help them achieve that goal? So again, lots more specificity and detail here. On the second page of our transition planning forms, all of these are outlined in a dotted green sort of boundary. This section really includes a specific delineation of agency involvement, which can be used to document the agencies and community organizations that a student is working with as part of their transition. However, I will note that the term agency is not clearly defined in the IEP form template or the stakeholders guide. And so it's unclear if this section is intended to include agencies like current employers or internship sites, or agencies for adult services like DDS or MRC. And so I think because this isn't clear in the form or the stakeholder guide, we're going to have to watch closely and work with our teams to see how districts respond. And we may gain some additional guidance from DESE as this new IEP form is rolled out more widely. In addition, and very importantly, the new IEP form now includes a specific section here. The bottom half of the form, you'll see the title Transfer of Rights to the Student. And this is really a specific section requiring the team to provide notification of a plan to transfer decision-making rights to a student when they turn 18. This must happen. The form requires that this must happen at least 1 year before the student's 18th birthday. And from my perspective, this the specificity here really provides an important prompt for parents and caregivers who may need to arrange safeguards like legal guardianship to preserve their ability to make decisions on their students' behalf as needed, right? And for other students who don't require legal guardianship, it really is a specific prompt that will help the team, parents, caregivers, and school staff begin to discuss whether or not there are certain things that we need to help the student learn, skills to help the student learn or develop so that they can effectively make some of their own educational decisions after their 18th birthday. Now, on the next slide here, this is the third page of our transition planning section. And you'll see that there's really an entire section dedicated to decision-making options for a student after age 18. This is totally new to the transition planning form and totally new to this new IEP form. It offers much more clarity around decision-making options for transitioning students. So for example, when the student turns 18, will they fully make their own educational decisions? Will they share that decision-making with a parent, caregiver, or another adult? Will they sort of delegate that decision-making to their parent, caregiver, or another adult? Or finally, will they have an appointed legal guardian in order to make decisions on behalf of a student? And the transition planning section of the new IEP form also includes a section dedicated to what is called adult service agency referrals, or what some people have called Chapter 688 referrals. So this includes details about both the timeline of the referral and the specific agencies to which a referral was made. So the requirement here is not new. School districts have always been required to refer students and their families to appropriate adult service providers and agencies like DDS or Mass Rehab Commission. However, this section is new. The old IEP form just had a line, one single line on it that said Chapter 688 referral date or something like that. And you'll see here, we now have a whole section that's a little bit more specific, walks the team through those steps and obligations, and lists out the specific agencies to which a referral was made. So again, some nice specificity here, lots of changes to this transition planning form section. And one of the biggest and most notable is that it is now included right in the middle of an IEP. It's not an add-on or an extra document at the end of the IEP. And Gretchen, I'll pass it back to you to review with us the new accommodations and modifications section.
Thank you, Lisa. This form offers much more structure and is more specific. And I just want to go through the top part, and when we're looking at the modifications and accommodations, because those are two different categories that are often confused by all. But for accommodations, we're going to start out with the presentation of instruction, the way the information is presented. And does the student will the student require a benefit from accommodations in the classroom in non-academic settings, which is a new emphasis to be on the form, extracurricular activities, and community and workplace. So again, it's that message of moving across the student's life in terms of what do they need in order to be able to have meaningful access to learning in all settings. And then there's going to be a recording or response, the way the student then responds to the accommodation, because that's going to help inform whether they need to, there needs to be a change in the accommodation based on the student's response. And then the timing and the scheduling, and then the settings. Okay. And then when we're looking at modifications, we still have the four areas across a continuum in the student's life of where they might need a modification. And so we have the content of the modification, where, what content areas should be modified. And then there's an instruction box. And I suppose that we could look at that many different ways, but one way to look at it, and one way that I would want to look at it as an educator, is what methodology is going to be used to accompany the modification. And I'll get back to that in a minute, but it seems that is the intent, because I'll read you a couple of examples that are listed as instruction. Adjusting a student's reading level, providing multisensory reading instruction, using hands-on manipulatives or materials to reinforce concepts. So that those are actions, and they're also methodology, because one of the important considerations in any student's IEP is, if we're going to have X amount of improvement, or there's going to be a meeting of a goal with 80% or 70% or whatever percent we're going to assign to it, what's the mechanism of change? In other words, how is the student going to meet that goal? For example, Johnny will read 80% of a grade-based text by October of 2023. And my question is how? What mechanism of change will be in place? What teaching methodology will be in place? What service providers will be working with the student, and what's the frequency? So I think that allows a little bit of revisiting of those types of critical questions and information that we would need. And then we're looking at the student output and how they're responding to the modifications. And again, that will help to inform over time whether there need to be changes in the modifications. So I think there's a little more of a safety guard and a little bit more of a, of a specific area that we can have input in moving forward. Okay. So, and then this section is very straightforward. We've all been considering for years, is the student geared toward passing the MCAS? If so, what accommodations would they need? So the first is just the obvious, that the student needs no accommodation. And the second would be that there would be accommodations needed. And then what areas do we need to accommodate? Because not every student needs accommodation in all of the major subject areas. And then if the answer is the student is not going to take a statewide test or an MCAS, then will they participate in an alternate assessment? And if so, we get to check off which areas. That's just a very straightforward part of the IEP that has been in place. I just think it's a little clearer to go through it and to ask these questions sequentially as we move forward. Okay. So now we're on the measurable annual goals. And this is where we really want to focus intently, because those annual goals are going to inform the progress that your child makes. So they're starting out with the goal area and then capturing the baseline information. What can the student currently do as they're compiling this IEP at the time that this IEP is going to be either rewritten or put into place? And then there's a careful consideration of what skills will the student be expected to attain by the end of the IEP time frame. And then again, we're getting into a measurement question. What criteria will be used to determine whether the goal has been achieved, and what will be the method of assessment? So those are very specific questions that will require answers that will inform instruction. And then how frequently will the progress be measured, and who will measure the progress? And then there are short-term objectives or benchmarks. And those are the smaller steps between the baseline and the measurable annual goal. And that's accentuated in the new IEP. And I think it's going to give us a chance to be able to look at what are those smaller steps that we need to put in place if it looks like the measurable annual goal is not going to be met, or what short-term objectives and benchmarks can we put in place to make it more likely that the student can move to a higher level of achievement of the goal sooner? Those would be questions that would come into my mind. And there may be other.
Briella, come on.
All right, Gretchen, are we ready for our next slide here?
Yeah, I just want to touch on the schedule of progress reporting.
Yeah, go ahead.
It just explained how parents how and when parents will be periodically informed. And that's pretty much the same as before, but it's delineated, and we can move forward, Lisa.
Thank you, Gretchen. In the next few slides, I'm going to review the final sections of the new IEP form before we get on to some big conclusions and some time for discussion. Here on this slide, you can see two sections that are familiar content from the old form with a few notable changes. So first, the participation section no longer includes inclusion designations by percentage of time that a student is in the general education setting. This does include a section for a narrative description, and from my perspective, it's going to require a more detailed narrative description, and parents may need to advocate for this more detailed information here if a team is preparing something that's sort of general or not super specific or clear. I do worry a bit about students who are pulled from inclusion, potentially more than a parent anticipates or expects, if a student's needs are not adequately supported in the inclusion setting. So for example, A student who may have been designated as a partial inclusion student on the past IEP form begins to experience increased behavioral challenges in the classroom and in the inclusion setting, and they require more support, maybe more support from a paraprofessional in the general education setting, right? I would be concerned that if the narrative here is not very detailed, a team could pull that student into a more restrictive environment without reconvening the IEP team. So remember, on the old form, when inclusion time was designated with a specific percentage, a team would have to maintain that level of inclusion or reconvene the team to make a change to that participation in general education information. So my hope is that we will see these meetings and conversations and continue, and there may be some sort of procedural safeguards that are rolled out to help manage this here, but this is certainly a section where there is less specificity than in the old form, which means it's something that we're going to want to watch closely to see how it is rolled out and implemented by districts. And then the second half of this page here is the service delivery grid. And this is a really easy one because it's nearly identical to the old IEP service delivery grid. We don't anticipate many changes or issues here, but I will note this main service delivery grid that we're looking at right now no longer includes extended school year services, but hold tight because we're going to see those in an upcoming section in just a minute. So this service delivery grid really identical to the old IEP form in many ways, with the exception of removing any extended school year supports. We're going to list those separately. Now, the new IEP form still addresses the need for transportation services, and the choices really remain pretty consistent with the old IEP form. It highlights the student's needs for things like assistance, attendance, or physical sort of person supports in transportation, modifications, or specific equipment. And the form also still addresses the need for schedule modifications, such as a longer or shorter day or year. However, this is another place where there's a little bit less specificity than on that old form. So now there's really a single yes or no question, whereas the old form broke things down into two separate questions where they asked if the student needed a shorter day or shorter year, whether the student needed a longer day or longer year. And so my concern or note here is that parents who are not familiar with the options may miss opportunities to request appropriate schedule modifications. For example, if you don't know that a longer year is a possibility or a longer day is a possibility, how would you even know to ask for this, right? So while many of the sections of the form add additional specificity, examples like this, the sections that I've commented on just recently here, may be places where we see a little bit less transparency, and we want to be extra cautious, especially if we're working to support those of you who are professionals on the call who are working to support parents or caregivers who may be less experienced with the IEP process or may not know just what to ask for. On this next slide, you're going to see now where extended school year and ESY transportation services are outlined. So we essentially have a second service delivery grid here with all the same information. The format is identical to the main service delivery grid. It's simply separated out so that it follows after the section where we make a decision about schedule modification, right? So that makes sense when we think about the flow of an IEP meeting. The team's going to review, does a student need a longer year? Yes. Okay. Next page, let's go ahead and outline what they need in that longer year. So I think it'll help with the flow of the meeting and conversations there, but also addresses transportation services for those ESY services. And finally, here you're going to see a section for additional information, as well as the response section for parents or caregivers to accept or reject the IEP. The additional information section invites parents to address things that are not previously included in the IEP template. So this might include things such as a specific homeschool communication or meeting plan with specific team members. It might include things like specific notes about data collection or details there. In this section, it is important to remember that any of the things you include here will not necessarily have specific goals or measurable benchmarks. And so you may want to consider how these elements can be included in more formal goals or services sections if it's appropriate, right? So if there's a really significant need that you're raising in the additional information section, I would want you to pause and reflect with your team about whether or not that need should be included somewhere else in the IEP that lists specific goals or specific services that your student might need. This brings us to the end of our review of the new IEP form. So this is sort of that final signature page. And from here, Gretchen's going to reiterate a few different points about how and where specifically parents and caregivers can be involved in the process of creating an IEP.
There are many points of entry for parents and caregivers. As you move through the IEP, it's important to keep in mind that you do have a very full and robust understanding of your student, of your child, and so that there's not a marginal piece of contribution in our view that you have. There is the parent and concern, student concern section. The vision statement, the student vision statement, now opens up a dialogue between the student, what their vision is, and the team response to the student vision statement. And that's a part of the IEP that the parent can be involved in, perhaps previewing with their child what it is that they would like to have them consider in the future. The vision statement will be from the student directly. However, there can be some pre-planning with the parent as well as pre-planning with the school. And language is written into the IEP such as, in response to the student vision statement, the team is responding, the parent is responding. So you can become involved in that. And then contribute to the present levels of academic and functional performance section. The behavioral and social and emotional components there, you could potentially bring to the discussion either a broadening of what's already been presented or a laser focus on certain areas of development that you feel your child needs to have. And that's really important to provide a contour of the student in a way that's not necessarily depicted otherwise. And then you can share information in the autism specific question areas as well. How do different aspects of learning or identified areas manifest in other settings, such as the home and the community, and provide examples. And all of those manifestations will need to be considered by the team, and also supports and instruction put in place. And then there's the additional parent comment section on the IEP that you can put information into. And there are many other points of entry, but these seem to be ones that might be easier. And again, the new IEP is set up in a manner that promotes discussion in certain areas, and that you can join. And I will share with you some of my impressions of a meeting that I had with a new IEP. I've only had one team meeting that I participated in with a new IEP. And these are my impressions of that meeting. It seemed to flow much more naturally, but the questions that the team chair was asking were very guided, and they moved very sequentially from one part to the next, with time for the parent and the team to respond. I thought that there was much more emphasis on the student being bilingual, as they happen to be, and what that brought about in terms of learning challenges and what specific teaching methodology would be put in place across curriculum, an emphasis on whether the parent understood the documents, the test documents, if they were understandable or translated into their native language. And then more of an expansive discussion on the modifications and accommodations and where they would apply throughout the IEP. And those were my impressions of that meeting. And I'm sure there'll be many more that we'll all participate in.
Thank you, Gretchen. I have not yet had an opportunity to participate in a meeting with the new IEP form, but you shared a number of great ideas for how parents can be actively involved in the co-creation of the IEP with this new form. So I look forward to seeing how that plays out. To wrap up, we want to remind you that the IEP process is complex and that the new changes and nuances of this form will certainly unfold over time. Just like you, we don't have all the answers now, but we want you to remember a few key takeaways. This form is available now on the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education website, or DESE's website. One of our participants today popped that link in the chat, and we've also got it in our references. A small number of districts will be implementing the new form this year, and we'll expect that all districts will use this form by next fall of 2024. As you begin to use the new form, you should expect some noticeable changes and increases in student participation in the process, even at the elementary and middle school level. So we had a question earlier about how soon the student is involved in contributing to the vision. And it appears as though the expectation would be that even at the early elementary level, the student would be involved in a developmentally appropriate way in contributing to that vision. However, as I mentioned earlier, we want to encourage you to consider how you may need to support or advocate for your child's voice to be heard, particularly if your student is minimally verbal or non-speaking. It's not clear how those students will engage in the process, and so I want you to keep an eye out for those opportunities to help your student's voice be heard, and we will learn as we go what is successful for students with a variety of skills. As with any changes, there are going to be growing pains, and we encourage you to monitor the impact of the new form on your child's educational program and services. And of course, share your questions and concerns with your school team and with your school administrators as you sort of move through this new process. We have some time tonight, just a few minutes here for some questions and discussion, and we've also included a couple of references and resources for your information here. Before we stop our recording and start some questions, I just want to thank you all for attending and really appreciate your attention this evening.